and welcome to Webex and BroadWorks, our webinar on understanding and optimizing the Webex BroadWorks connection. We're glad you are here. My name is Mark Lindsay. I'm one of our senior members of technical staff and your host today. And I've been with ECG for the same number of years as Sherwin Crown. Thanks for joining us today, Sherwin. Sherwin is one of our vice presidents, a senior member of technical staff here at ECG. He's got more experience with Webex for BroadWorks than anybody else I know or know of. Is actively involved in migrations and onboarding for Webex for BroadWorks service providers and systems for operations that have users around the world and primarily in the US, Canada, and Caribbean. He's worked with BroadWorks systems since 2003. He's helped with the deployment of many of the major BroadWorks service providers around the world. And he holds a master's in computer science focused on cybersecurity. So welcome, Sherwin. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
So we're going to go over our agenda today. But one of the first questions we frequently get asked is, where is BroadWorks going? So what's the future for BroadWorks? And the common statement you'll sometimes hear is, well, BroadWorks it's going away. It's being end of life or something like that. And these are completely untrue. We have great relationships with the Cisco team that manages the BroadWorks product, and it is continuing to grow and evolve. But this reminds me a little bit of the sort of the market battle between AC and DC power. Ultimately, AC power won out. And one short way of looking at the market situation with BroadWorks is that BroadWorks kind of won a lot of the battles that they were fighting. So what they did was they found a place in practically all of the major service providers and many of the small and medium service providers as well. So they achieved a lot of their goals, and that's where Cisco came in. Nearly all of the largest service providers around the world operate BroadWorks at their core, potentially alongside other platforms as well. So there's a lot of great platforms out there. And so BroadWorks is one big element of that. You can look at some of the fixed mobile convergence products out there that are really big, where you can have a mated cell phone service with your business phone service, call center based services. A lot of these are built with BroadWorks at their heart. But what we're seeing is that once you've kind of won this large market, there's not the same need for the same kind of marketing communications that is common prior to that point. And so BroadWorks is big. It's continuing to grow. As I've got here, 25 out of 30 of the largest service providers worldwide offer BroadWorks services. It's got over 40 million BroadWorks users globally. And this is actually a growing number. This is something folks don't know. But if you think of this like AC power, it's not really surprising that basically a fundamental infrastructure item is continuing to grow like this. And it's distinctly secure. One independent analyst recently said at IT Expo just a couple of weeks ago that compared to Teams and Zoom, Webex is one of the most secure meeting platforms available. And so there's no wonder why BroadWorks operators would wish to integrate with Webex and integrate that product in as one of their product offerings. So where's BroadWorks going? Well, it's going up. It's growing. So today we're going to cover a lot. This training will be available as a video to watch later. You'll be able to ask some live questions here towards the end. So you can use the Q&A panel inside the Webex, inside the Zoom to ask your questions about the Webex integration with BroadWorks. So go ahead and you can send in those questions, and we'll take those at the end of the segment and the live Q&A part in section 6. And if you're watching this as a recorded video, what you're going to see there is the things that came to mind when our live audience was watching this. So please do join in with those live questions. We're going to start today with an introductory tour of the major components in the BroadWorks integration with Webex. Next, we'll talk about some of the core functional leaks that have to be maintained between a BroadWorks service provider and Webex. And then we're going to move into troubleshooting. So with those common problems, first focus on the issues that primarily affect individual users or new customer activations. And then second, looking at the kind of systems that have to, or the troubleshooting that's done operationally. System-wide problems that can crop up just in ongoing maintenance, or maybe you're doing mergers or acquisitions activity where you're taking a BroadWorks network and you're splitting it or combining it, that kind of thing. And then, of course, we'll finish up with your questions. So go ahead and send in questions as they come to mind. And Sherwin, can you get us oriented with the primary connections between BroadWorks and Webex that we're going to discuss today?
Yes, of course. So let's take a step back first and take a look at a freshly minted BroadWorks Webex for BroadWorks client. So what we're looking at here before we get behind the scenes is if you get everything to work and you actually deploy something and log in, this is kind of the interface that you're going to get for a desktop client, right? So what we're looking at here is the Webex interface, which looks familiar. You should see messaging and meetings. You should also see like Teams and contacts. So those are familiar concepts of Webex. But what they did here was they did the integration with BroadWorks, which provided the calling and voicemail feature. And so looking at this, you can say, well, there's only two items here, so this can't be a big deal to deploy. But at the start of this, when you go talk to Cisco and talk about rolling out Webex, they're going to give you a 4-month span for actually deploying this thing. That's their estimate of how long it takes to deploy. Now, will it really take that long? It depends on your experience level and how experienced you are with Webex and how experienced you are with BroadWorks. For deploying new servers, deploying new apps, and also configuring the organization in the Webex cloud. So behind the scenes, this is an extract or a modified extract from the Webex Solutions Guide. And you'll notice that they are the normal Webex cloud or the partner hub, customer hub section over here. And from a Webex client, what I just mentioned here was that the messaging and the meetings and stuff are all handled in that side of the house. So that's the normal operations of Webex. But for integration, we have these call flow lines on the left-hand side over here. So what we're going to talk about in a little bit is each of these lines and what it takes to actually make these go. So to start off here, there's system administration. To get that system administration to Partner Hub, you're going to need your customer org, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. We have flow through provisioning, which is once you provision stuff in Webex, how do you get your BroadWorks subscriber data into Webex? We're going to talk about SSO, which is how does Webex actually come in and authenticate to your BroadWorks platform? And then we're going to talk about push notification. And this feature here is voice calling. So push notification and voice calling is kind of like a relic from the UC1 business communicator concept. So that's not necessarily new, except that if you notice these lines here for push notification doesn't go directly to the APNS and FCM like you had in the past with your own branded app. It actually goes off to the Webex cloud for proxying, right? So let's start with the core links. So the idea here is, where do you start? So like I mentioned here is that before you can start doing anything, you actually need your own Cisco Webex organization ID. And that comes into this cloud piece here that needs to be configured, right? So the catch with this piece is that before Cisco gives you this organization ID, you actually have to participate in their training program. And so the requirements for you to get an org ID is that you need 2 members from the technical training and 2 members from the sales side of training. And so a lot of folks, when they usually approach us, they're like, we want to deploy Webex and we need it done like today. And we have to stop them and say like, okay, so who in your organization for your org ID is actually going to perform in this training? And what time do they have? Because the training course is, I don't know, just the length of video is somewhere between 6 hours or 4 to 6 hours, depending on if you can pass the test quizzes at the end, you don't have to retake anything. So you need to kind of log that time in for if your staff is busy and they don't have time to do this and take tests for each section and pass these tests. Then Cisco might push back and actually give you an org ID to even start the process. So that being said, is once you pass their requirement for an org ID, you would actually get your logging into the Partner Hub interface. And if you notice here, this is a sample organization ID. And this value here becomes important for the following steps. So let's talk about one of those steps. So for this SSO link to work, you actually needed first your org ID, and then you have to actually send off a request to Cisco saying, okay, I meet your requirement, I have my org ID, now I need the link between the BroadWorks auth service and WebEx. And so you have to send out that request for this link to come through. The gotcha here is that they will provide you credentials for this link, but you need to pay attention to which CI cluster and which team cluster you're actually participating with. Because if you put in the wrong URL for each of these things, then your links will never come up. And so you're going to be back and forth attack trying to figure that out. So the way you do this is they provide you your org ID. You then have to turn around and log into the Partner Hub and then go to the help desk and then search your org ID. And then from there, you'll see they come down here with the cluster ID and teams, team clusters. And then you have to go back to the solutions guide and look at their table and say, okay, so I'm in cluster USAB. What's the URL for USAB for me to populate these values in here? And what's the URL for team cluster AOR for me to populate in here? And once you populate that in, you go back and enable the service and look at the auth logs, and then you'll see it actually come up and say that the credentials worked and everything was okay. So that's step one after your org ID. Step two is the other side of that, which is your proxying, push notification proxy methodology. So for this side to work, you're going to need another Cisco request saying, okay, so I have my org ID. You guys are agreeing that I'm going to, use WebEx for BroadWorks on mobile clients, which is a tablet and your mobile phone. And I need to be able to send push notifications out to those guys. But I am fully aware that I'm using the branded Cisco app, not like how we used to do it in the UC1 days where I'm running my own app. So I need your permission for actually sending these notifications out to this application ID, because not anybody can do that by design. And so they will take your org ID again, and then they will send you back some new credentials. So you'll see here, they have the client ID, the secret, and the refresh token that you'll put in here. And what you'll have to do is go into your push notification server and link their branded app. So for Android, that's com.cisco.wx2.android. And for iOS, that's com.cisco.squared. Now, some folks might ask, well, does that cover mobile and tablet? The answer is yes, it does. So both your mobile and tablet uses the same branded app ID in this case. And so you would actually enter that in here and then enter your proxy for your tokens, which is the example here on the left-hand corner. And that will allow you, for when your application server sends out push notifications for updates or invites, that would allow you to proxy through the WebEx proxy off to Android or Apple for them to get your push notifications appropriately. So now you got some interactions going. And so now we need to talk about this link here. So how do I get my BroadWorks information into WebEx? And the preferred method is flow-through provisioning, right? So to do that, you need two things to pull that off. You need the cluster defined in the WebEx environment. And that cluster is what ADP servers, which would be your WebEx required ADP servers, but it has the auth service and the CTI interface and all these other XSI actions and events and everything else that WebEx is going to use. Like what cluster, what FQDN, or redundant FQDN, hopefully, unless you're running to an F5 and single FQDN, what cluster you're actually going to use to authenticate against, right? So that's kind of what you're defining here. So for this guy, you're actually putting in, you put a cluster name, whether it's production or lab or whatever it is, or cluster production A, production B, Europe versus USA, whatever you're doing. And then you can actually check your connections, which access actions and events URL, put in your BroadWorks credentials. And this allows you to kind of step through the process of like, all right, so I have a test BroadWorks user. I pointed it to the FQDN for my WebEx portal, and I want to check that each of these services will work, is what this basically does for you. So you'll go through and say, oh, okay, with this credential, can I get an XSI action response? Yes, I can. Can I get an external events response? Yes, I can. Can I get a CTI interface to work? Yes, I can. Can I get auth service to work? Yes, I can. If any of those fail, obviously this won't complete. And so once you get that, you can then go to step 2, which is creating the flow through templates. So the way this works is that Webex actually uses templating to provision your users, right? So this saves you a bunch of clicks. I mean, you can change these things after the fact, obviously. But what you're doing here is you're actually creating a template with different criteria. And those criteria are things like Webex licensing. It has authentication methods. It has user creation methods, whether it's trusted versus untrusted. And all of those steps that would be required for your user experience is handled inside this template. Now, at the end of this process, you'll get a FQDN with the credentials that you entered in here for your authentication that you put into interface messaging. And once you put that in there, you can then proceed to actually provisioning a user and get that provisioning flowed through to Webex. But one thing here that I wanted to point out was this authentication method, because normally for small service providers, they use the BroadWorks authentication method, right? So what that means is that when you log into Webex, you will be redirected to a portal, a Webex portal, and that Webex portal will be authenticating against your BroadWorks cluster. And so the email address that you use for Webex and the BroadWorks credentials will be used to log you into Webex, is what BroadWorks authentication means. The flip side of that is some folks have decided that, you know what, I don't want to deal with any Webex login criteria. And so they use the top one here, which is Webex authentication. And so what that does is that every time you create a user, they get an activation email off from Webex and say, all right, so we're going to use this email address. I need you to enter a new password, and your credentials are now handled by Cisco Webex itself, which is a different password from your BroadWorks. So your Compilot versus your Webex authentications are two separate entities. Versus for your BroadWorks authentication, it's the same thing, right? And so you can use all of Webex, login security credentials if you wanted in this guy, and completely be different from your BroadWorks authentication. The other side of that is folks decided that, you know what, we already have like an SSO platform that we're dealing with for all of our customers. And so we don't need Webex to handle anything. And we really, don't want to be managing BroadWorks authentication either. So they do an integration with their IDP, and then they use SSO over their partner authentication mechanism, right? Whether it's Okta or whatever they're doing. And then the last one here, which is relatively new, is OpenID Connect, which uses OpenID credentials to actually do the same thing, right? So general versus a more specific methodology. So once you get all of that going, you can then log into Compilot, create a user, and then you can start the process of creating a Webex user. And to do that, you would actually need one to provision the messaging interface, like we talked about. So when the template has been created, you got the URL, and then in that template, you put a username and password in there. So you would have to put those in here. And this, as you notice here, is done at the system level, but just, for testing purposes or migration purposes, when folks are migrating from, UC Connect to Webex, they also patched the application service to where you could have done this at the enterprise level or the group level. So you can migrate, group sectors out of an enterprise or the entire enterprise at a time instead of a system-wide migration method, right? But for the most part, system is where you're going to end up. All your users are going to go to Webex, so this is the interface that you're going to use. If you didn't have a lab and you needed to test something, then group and enterprise level would be another option there. So for this slide here, we're talking about what does it look like if you provision something properly. So in the Compilot, I'm assuming most folks here are familiar with the Compilot interface. You have your user profile page. That user profile page on the very bottom will have an email address field. That email address field has to be populated for WebEx provisioning. In addition to that, the email address has to be in the alternate ID tab, also in that for that user profile. And the reason for that is that WebEx only knows about the email address, not your BroadWorks user ID for your component ID, right? So you're kind of linking those two together. So you're giving an alternate identity for your BroadWorks user, whether it's your DID, whatever you use for your provisioning methodology. And once you enable and activate IMP, what's going to happen is that the BroadWorks application server is going to send it off the provisioning URL, which is what you provided here in that interface messaging parameter. And if you notice here, I highlighted, just a lab test WebEx user, and you kind of pull that out of the email address field. And then if it works, you should get a 200K response in the PS log. If it doesn't work, you're going to get some more interesting responses. Like, the user is already linked to another org, or, this is the user's linked to a free user account, and there's more steps that needs to be done. Now, admittedly, that last statement I made still comes back in a 200K versus another org is a bigger error. Because they use a 200K for that guy because there's an additional step that the user will get to ask them if they want to convert on the far side. So technically, they can be converted. It's just in a pending state. So they cannot split it up. Before, when 2 years ago when this was first done, that was an automatic error. But I think Cisco realized that most folks had a free account, so they had to do something. And so now they had an integration transitioning methodology that goes on there. Now here is an example of Mark Lindsay, and Mark actually showed an example of his email address in there. So if that exists there, then MRL at ECG would actually be in this field here. So this field here is linked to that field there, right?
Cool. Thanks a lot for that, Sherwin. There was a lot you covered there. It's really helpful to see, for me, to see the connectivity between BroadWorks and WebEx clarified like that, kind of what the different functions are. Because as you pointed out, there's a several round trip between a BroadWorks service provider and Cisco to kind of organize that stuff, and then there's even some cross-referencing to put it together. And I'm expecting this is going to happen if you're, let's say, an existing WebEx for BroadWorks service provider, but you're starting a new business unit. Maybe you're starting operation in a new country. You might, like, if you've got an independent organization, you might end up going through some of this stuff before, even if your WebEx for BroadWorks is already built, or if you're, splitting a partitioning a system, somebody else is having to kind of reconnect some of this stuff. But these are the fundamental links that they're going to look at. Let's transition now to looking at some of these common problems. And I know we've split this up into two sections. One is troubleshooting related to individual user or maybe single customer, maybe a customer meaning a group or an enterprise type of customer, but not system-wide. So can you get us started there? What are some of those issues that you've seen that affect individual users or maybe new user activations?
Sure. So the first one we're going to talk about is the whole, let's take a step back. So there's a general concept of WebEx is WebEx, but that the customer has, that ideology that the customer has, but that is not the case. WebEx for BroadWorks is not the same as WebEx. And the reason why we're putting this up front is because a lot of trouble tickets from other service providers that I've spoken to comes from users saying, hey, I read on the help desk page that I should be able to do this sort of WebEx integration, but I can't get it to work. I do the steps and nothing works. Like, what's going on here? And then you have to go back and forth with them saying, that feature is not supported here, or that app is not supported here. And he's like, well, it's WebEx. Why shouldn't this work? And he's like, no, you're in WebEx for BroadWorks. You're not in WebEx. And so there's that back and forth that has to go with the customer education process. So currently in the solutions guide, there's only a few integrations that are supported, and that is Zendesk, which requires a premium WebEx license, Slack, which requires a premium WebEx license. And the reason why they're pointing that out is that there are 4 different licensing. There's soft phone only, there's basic, there's standard, and there's premium. And so you have to be at the very top of your premium package before you can even think about these things. And your user base has to be at the top before they can think about these things. Now, depending on your model, you might not be selling that to them. So even if they do say that this is supported, there's licensing restrictions around them that you have to be aware of. All right. If you notice there's Microsoft Teams that needs standard or premium. So although you have a Microsoft Teams WebEx meetings, so as long as you have, like your basic package that has your 40-minute meeting limit, that still doesn't meet the criteria for WebEx meetings. For Teams meetings. So you can't use that here either. The Microsoft Teams calling is supported in all packages, which makes sense because if you want dial tones for your WebEx Teams integration, then any one of these should work. You have Office 365 calendaring, which is standard or premium, or your Google Suite, which is standard or premium. So from looking at this, if you're trying to do integrations, you need to at least be standard before you consider them, unless you're doing Microsoft Teams calling, or more than likely you're going to need to be on premium for these are special cases. So there's definitely costs associated with these integrations. The other common item is what I kind of touched on previously, which is pre-existing WebEx account. So the two common issues here are the customer creates a free WebEx account before, but didn't remember that they even created one, or they knew, but they thought that, by some magic that you would take care of everything because, you're working for Cisco now, or you're working for WebEx now, so you should be able to take care of this. But that's not how it works, right? So you have to, the idea here is that in the WebEx organization or the cloud, basically, that each email address can only be linked to one WebEx account, and each WebEx account can only be linked to one organization, WebEx organization. So if you notice there, our very first step was we needed our service provider WebEx organization, which made us unique. So if that WebEx account previously existed, that means they're in another WebEx organization of whatever flavor. And so for this to work in your environment, you need to get them out of that organization into your organization. Now, sometimes if they're on like the free account, that's an easy process versus if they're on, another specific WebEx organization for another entity of whatever it is, then that requires admin privileges in that other organization to kind of detach them from that and bring them over to yours. And that is not an easy process because for one, whoever holds that account might not want to release it because, or just give you a hard time to release it. And then the other thing is it's very destructive for you to kind of pull stuff out and bring it back in other organizations. From what I've seen is a destructive process, which means you kind of delete something and add it back, which means you kind of lose your history of what you had there. So keep in mind of what email address you're trying to use and whether or not that email address is already associated with an account. Now you can use APIs in WebEx to actually look at that account before you even start this process. They provide this to see if that is already linked. So that's an option there too. Then say, hey, this is linked. Do you want us to go through this lengthy process, or do you want to use a new email address, or how do you want this to look like, or all that fun stuff. So there's a lot of behind the scenes activities that needs to happen just to create the account in the first place. And then the second one, which I kind of touched on before from making another point, is that not all packages in WebEx are the same. So I've gotten, trouble calls from folks saying, hey, like customers are just getting shut off of their meetings, and it's happening, in that 30-minute to 40-minute window. But I can't replicate it on my user no matter what I try. And the reason for that is because their user is on a standard or premium package versus the customer is on a basic package. And so you need to be very aware of what features is assigned to what package when you're signing out to customers, because basic package says it has meeting support, but it also says it's limited. And so if they're having an hour-long call, guess what's going to happen? At 40 minutes, all of the users get kicked off. They can rejoin the meeting, but in another 40 minutes, they all get kicked off because that's what they signed up for. So you just got to be aware of what the packages and what the features limitations are in each of those packages. Now, for this one is a primary line setting. So this affected Android customers in recent WebEx releases, software releases. So the way this happened is that we had, you had the Android client, you had the iOS client. In this test scenario here, the user was able to log in just fine with the iOS client for tablet using the tablet template. But for some reason, it just wouldn't work with the tablet Android client. And what we found here is that the Android client was actually looking at an additional parameter when it got the XSR response back from the ADPs, when it was actually doing a device lookup list. And so what the Android client did was, if this primary line port was not activated, it actually skipped over this this device template and refused to download your configs, which then disabled phone services. So what I included here was an extract from the client log. And what you can see here is that the client did its request off to the ADPs. It got a list of devices, so basically the request was, tell me all the devices this user owns. So I can know, if one exists that I can use to actually provision this device type is what it's asking you to do. And so, I got a succeeded list. So, yeah, I got a list. I got a business communicator PC for this user. I got a Connect Mobile for this user. I got a Connect Tablet for this user. And what you see here is the use value here, which is controlled by this primary radio button, was set to 0 versus the other ones worked. So testing with the Android client on mobile worked fine because that one was a 1, right? But for the tablet, that one was a 0, so that didn't work at all. And so you're trying to figure out, well, how can tablet be broken and mobile is not broken? Like, what's going on here? Is our template completely broken? Like, what's happening here? And if you look at the very bottom of the log here, it says Connect Tablet is not found, but it says right there it found a Connect Tablet. Like, why is it saying Connect Tablet is not found? And so the root of the cause was the value has to be 1 because Android is actually looking at this use value, whereas iOS was not. To actually determine, whether or not it's actually going to use the FQDN and the login credentials for this device to actually go get the config file in the first place. So that being said, to avoid this, make sure all of your active all of your primary lines are book checked and active, so you don't run into this and have to be chasing it down with tech.
Yeah, let me interrupt something. Just a tactical thing in terms of troubleshooting. The slide says this, so if anybody's has a chance to watch this and kind of look at the slides in more detail, but if you're new to troubleshooting WebEx, which I'm pretty new to troubleshooting WebEx for sure, Sherwin points out that this is actually the log we're looking at here was actually uploaded from the WebEx mobile client. It's actually the tablet software running on an Android platform. And so this was uploaded to Customer Hub, and then they can be downloaded. So then you get the text file to view. So that's the workflow to actually get access to the log that he's showing here. Previously, we looked at another case where we're looking at a log for the provisioning process that's actually on the BroadWorks application server where the user's hosted, and there's a PS log file there. And so that PS log is probably one of the standard logs. If you're like a lot of BroadWorks operators, you mostly look at excess logs, but the provisioning activity is in the current PS log. It rotates just like the excess log. So a couple of different places there, and he's going to show an example, I think, of another place you look kind of like analyzing this. So just in terms of building out your tactical skills for troubleshooting these things, it's helpful to know kind of where to look for different kinds of data that's available. Sherwin, if there's others that you want to point out, please, feel free to emphasize those too.
Yeah, I think you made a good point. When it comes to WebEx, I think that's one of the biggest changes that folks like service providers had to run into, that they experienced, right? Like when they had the UC Connect solutions for mobile and tablet, what they had was a link there that says email your address to support or whatever, and they would come to you. That doesn't exist in WebEx. They find that a little too insecure, sending emails around, apparently. Which, that's a valid point, actually. But so to make this work is you actually have to send all of your logs up to Customer Hub, and then you have to log in the Customer Hub and go to the troubleshooting section, and then search the login ID, which is the email address for that user, and then find the log that you uploaded, and then download that log. And the other side of that, which I didn't really touch on here, is that this, if you notice here, there's nothing really personal about what's here other than the list of devices. These logs are heavily redacted. Like most of the stuff in here are gone. Like you really need to know what you're looking for to find it, because you're not going to find a user ID or anything in this. And so again, they're trying to be as secure as possible. They're trying to encrypt all the private information at rest. So good for them. But for the service provider and troubleshooting, it's horrible. But you make it work.
It's not horrible. It
All
just
right.
takes new skills.
It definitely takes new skills. You really need to know what you're doing now, because you can't just like search for a log. I'm just going to search for this user ID. No, it doesn't exist.
Mhm.
So okay. All right. So the other symptom here is one-way audio issues, and this became especially prevalent during COVID and stuff like that, where folks started working from home and doing all this stuff. Where people need to be aware now that, or companies need to be aware now that voice is actually traveling over their VPN connections, because that wasn't the case before. So what we've seen here is that folks started getting a lot of one-way audio issues or stuff like that, because when they're on the VPN and the packets are traveling through these different firewalls, there were no firewall rules allowing you to go to, the self-registration proxies. And so there's none of these things that work, or RTP ports weren't made available, for UDP connections versus, TCP connections. Maybe they were just blocking all UDP connections, but allowing TCP, which allows you to register, send an invite, but not get media. So a weird combination of things started happening, where folks were noticing that, once I'm off the VPN, things work fine, but as soon as I jump on here, stuff are acting weird. And so they now, need to get these business security groups involved, saying, we need media to flow through here if they're going to be on this VPN connection. And so now they have to start making paths to allow this stuff to happen. If not, it may or may not work. All right. So those are more individual items. So let's talk about some system-wide operations here. We can keep moving along. So this one here was released last year, and this was a directory synchronization issue, right? So what happened here is that we need to be aware that there are backend certificates that are being distributed by Cisco for mutual cert authentication. In this case here, it was mutual cert with TLS for the CTI, secure CTI interface, which is 8012. And that these certificates may change if Cisco deems it necessary or not. They had previous certs before 2023, and then they decided that they needed to move over to a more internal one. But other things may change. We don't know. So I know they sent like emails out, like, a couple months in advance saying this was happening. So try to make sure that you do this. And, surprisingly, a lot of folks still didn't do it. And so they had to have like Webex rooms with different customers saying, hey, I noticed that you haven't updated your TLS certificates yet. This stuff is going to expire. Can you please go ahead and do this before your service is shut off? So that actually happened there too. Like if you were too slow, they started polling you, trying to prompt you to get it the right way before you cause an outage on yourself. So just be aware that if you're going to go through the solution, that there are certificate expirations. Now, granted that for this case here, these certificates are internal privately signed certs that are expiring way in the future. So hopefully they don't decide to change those, and you don't have to worry about this for 20 years. But if they decide that, maybe this was compromised and something needs to happen, then so be it. So just be aware that you need to pay attention to the certificates that's being used in the environment. Is basically what we're trying to say here.
Yeah, and like you pointed out, this information is generally delivered by email to the folks who originally set up the organization. Is that right? That like when you register your org ID. So if you've had staff rotation out, so if you've had staff rotation out, then those original email addresses are going to be the people who get this email, unless you maintain that. So, and like you said, we looked at this expiration date on that certificate. It's way in the future, but it seems like what Cisco's been doing is periodically just for whatever internal reasons they have, they've decided to revoke old ones and replace them with new ones. In effect, they've started using new certificates, and what we've seen, like you said, is they send out a lot of email notifications. They just went to specific people and specific addresses. So getting that right, so you're getting those notifications, is important, because I like you said, your customers, your end users will get the notifications too. At least that's the practice that they've taken, if you're a little slow on getting that update done.
Yeah. So just be aware of that. And obviously, like you're talking about, yes, that's a good point. It's because if your admin user that created the template that will be linked to this user creation has moved on, and their email address has either been discontinued or no longer monitored, then you didn't get anything after that. And so like I said, they were actually, starting meeting rooms with different service providers saying, hey, I noticed you haven't done this. Can you please do it? Like, do you need help? Like, do you not understand the instructions? Like, they started asking like specific questions of, let's try not to cause an outage if we don't have to here. So obviously folks may have gotten in and discarded it as trash, or folks may have not have gotten in at all. Okay, so the other issue here was with the templates and IDP updates. So for folks that have been provisioning this, especially with the PC ones, all of them really, so let me back up. So Cisco's expecting that you do, when I talked to TAC last time, they're expecting that you do at least quarterly updates on your templates, at least. They would prefer monthly if you're allowed to do it. And what they're saying is that they're releasing these templates, and these templates has new tag values, and has new features, and you can't utilize these features, or technically you are utilizing them, you're just using the default values, which in essence most of them are turned on, except for a few are turned off. And so you need to be updating a template so you actually be able to activate and use those features appropriately. However, due to lack of time, or I think it's more due to the fact that folks are used to working with the old style business communicator branded, clients, that you controlled when the apps are deployed. And so you can regression test, take your time, and deploy these apps as you see fit. This is the big change that's happening. You no longer control when these things are updated. Cisco pushes out new versions of these clients whenever they see fit. Unless you're under some sort of device management scheme, I would assume that's the only time you can get control over this. And so, your app, your mobile app, tablet, and your PC app will update monthly if Cisco deems that necessary. And so, what would happen is there are situations where folks would actually have that primary line issue that we talked about in the past, where a lot of those were turned off, and then they updated the client, and then all of their stuff stops working. And so there's a tag now that has to be released to say, you know what, we want to ignore this primary line value entirely, so you can go back to the original behavior. Like weird stuff like that starts happening. So make sure you keep track of your templates and the updates accordingly, because Cisco's pushing new clients whether you want to or not. It's basically the summary of it. Now, interesting enough, if you actually look at some of those detail files, like if you look at the latest business computer PC detail file, you notice that the number of ports allowed, which was originally 1, which is the same as mobile and tablet, they were all 1 in the past, have continually been changing. It went from 1 to 10, and now it's actually set to unlimited. And if you actually look in the latest UCAS desktop 3920 44.3 detail, you'll notice that there's now 10 line ports in a PC client. Before there was only 1. So what that means is that in the latest desktop client, if you actually have 10 or unlimited, you can now utilize 10 shared call appearances in the desktop client, which is a new feature that they're kind of just releasing. They're not making a lot of noise about it yet, but it's in the template file, and according to engineering, it should work. So, how well it works, well, it's remain to be seen, but it should work. So again, these are new features that are being deployed, but if you were originally if you deployed your PC client, more than 2 years ago, your line ports is limited to 1, so you can't use past line port 1 anyway. So now you need to come back and ask, like, how do we actually change this value? Now, Cisco recommendation is that you need to now deploy a new detail file, which would now have the new unlimited, and then you need to control migration of your client over to the other one. So you can use a software such as ECG's Alpaca to kind of move these things for device migrations, or you need to come up with another method of you manually doing this yourself. That's the supported way, unless you go try to change something in the database, which may or may not update all your values, and take risks there. So those are the kind of things that you need to be aware of and how you'd actually go about doing these things. So keep up with it, because they're changing things, and you might not be realizing all that's changing. But just because the client starts doesn't mean it's up to where it needs to be. The other issue is password expiration rules. So I think most of you, well, I shouldn't say that. It's known that the BroadWorks authentication method, that you can actually like set password expiration rules in the BroadWorks application server. However, those rules are enforced by Compilot, and they're avoided by the APIs unless you do something else. But and so when it comes to password expiration rules, if you're using BroadWorks authentication, you might have explicit password rules that you need it to expire every 30 days or whatever. But if the customer is using Compilot, their password never expires, and so you would never get that rotation to take effect, right? So your system might not be as secure as you think it is when you're starting to go down this route of using API authentication, which is what Webex is using. So, you got to be careful there, because what's happening is that, if the password expires, it means that they can log into Webex. So they're like, fine, my credentials should work. But then they try to log into Compilot and it doesn't work, weird stuff like that, because their password has expired. So you just need to be aware that there are certain gotchas when it comes to authenticating over API versus not. And then for this one here is more of a need to know when it comes to the BroadWorks conferencing the IDs versus your bring your own PSTN methodology. So what this is that Cisco allows you to bring your own numbers or bring your own PSTN. And you can do that by setting up a SIP interface that actually goes through your SBCs. Then you set up a voice XML user, which is a virtual user in the BroadWorks cluster. And then you can set it up in the network server as the origination redirect. And that allows you to, in essence, at a high level, that allows you to do inbound outbound from your meetings, right? With your own personal numbers, which when somebody calls into your number, it actually routes through to Webex, and that would have a particular SIP URI. But that SIP URI would be provisioned in the Webex cloud to know which meeting you're going to, et cetera, and you will get in there. The key thing here is that Cisco is providing Cisco numbers right now. They're not saying that they're providing it indefinitely. They're telling you that they're allowing you to use this for easier transition. What that means is that when they decided that you either need to pay them or you need to bring your own solution to the table, then you have things like your Webex user meetings that has dialing numbers that are linked to Cisco numbers instead of you're bringing your own PSTN numbers. And so when you're ready to do transitioning and stuff like that, then that becomes a little bit messy in terms of what number is being used, et cetera. The other part of this too is that for the bring your own PSTN solution, it requires the SBC to support simple TLS and SRTP for the access interfacing to the access interface to Webex, right? And then Webex requires standard or premium license too for that whole integration. So just be aware that when you're setting stuff up, that stuff is working currently, but Cisco, as any big organization, can change their mind on what they support today versus tomorrow. So you might need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I think an interesting point, if you can go back to that slide, just to underline, you and I were talking about, Sherwin, was that Cisco Webex bring your own PSTN is not the same as bring your own carrier that you see with a lot of service providers, or even bring your own carrier with Cisco Contact Center. This bring your own PSTN is assuming that because you're a BroadWorks operator, you actually already own a network, and so you're if you're doing business with, let's say, Comcast or Cent, your bandwidth, just to pick three big ones, that you're going to be routing those calls inbound through your BroadWorks system. You just sort of briefly overviewed kind of the architecture that's necessary on the app server and network server to route that call back through, but it's going to go back out through your SBC, and you as the BroadWorks service provider are going to have the TLS and SRTP connection to Cisco. So kind of an upside there is, well, you don't really have to depend on, your PSTN provider offering TLS and SRTP with the, compatible certificate management to what Cisco's doing, because that effect means that you have to do that. If you want to take advantage of this feature, you've got to build that out. So just wanted to underline that, because that's an interesting distinction. When they say bring your own PSTN, I'm actually really glad that the Cisco product managers chose a different term, because bring your own carrier kind of means something different. And it's not the same thing, even though some of the functionality is related. So thanks for overviewing that for us. We do have some live Q&A we can jump to. We can jump into that questions section here. So this is probably a pretty quick one, Sherwin. Are there additional BroadWorks licenses that need to be purchased or installed on BroadWorks for a new Webex for BroadWorks deployment?
No, the short answer is no. The license requirements for Webex for BroadWorks on the BroadWorks platform is integrated instant messaging. So once you have that, you don't need the whole. I think they used to have like Connect and sharing and all these other licenses in the past. None of that matters anymore.
Gotcha. Okay, because you're effectively buying those functions through the WebEx package,
Correct.
which
The
is
sharing
a separate
stuff and meetings are always through WebEx, which comes in the
right,
licensing for WebEx at that point.
which is a separate invoice, really. So,
Correct.
okay, another question, probably a little bit that covers the BroadWorks side and honestly the BroadWorks distribution side. So, what do you know about the future of containerization on BroadWorks, or are they going to be moving towards a microservice architecture? Have you seen any? Is there any evidence that they're moving towards a containerized distribution method?
I have seen zero evidence of them moving to a containerized option. I have
Mm,
heard in engineering talks way back when that they were kind of talking about doing some of those things, but I've never seen anything come to fruition about that personally as yet. So maybe
okay,
engineering is still working on it. I don't know.
gotcha. Any evidence of? I mean, I know there's a lot of applications deployed with separate endpoints that run on the ADP. Have you seen anything else, kind of evidence of move towards microservices, Best Verge?
No,
Think
I'm
we
kind of pausing here because if you think about, the push notification service on an ADP, that's kind of a microservice, just an application running over there.
right?
But no, not at this time. No.
Thanks for that. So another question that came in from the audience was, so you were talking about, if you flip back a few slides, you were talking about the changes in the IDPT template. So the right here, that's right. So with the IDPT and template updates, um, does Cisco kind of tell us what needs to be updated, or like IE, are they saying, hey, you should go update the template file for the config.wxt? Are they telling us that, or are they just saying, hey, here's a new DTAP, go do it? What kind of detail do we get from Cisco? Because you kind of called out a case where like, well, they seem to be changing some fairly fundamental default values in tag sets and functionality. But also, like this is the hardest example of the number of ports being allowed, which is not a changeable value in an identity device profile type. It's once that was created, you're stuck there. But then in another case, well, it's fairly easy to accommodate some of these changes, but not others. So, what kind
Correct.
of information are we getting from Cisco to help us with that transition?
Cisco has their deployment guide for the WebEx client, and inside of that, they give you a list of all. They actually have like the releases or changes that they made in each update. So there are changes for tags added. Um, so I guess that would be the place that I would look first to see your incremental changes. Um, so yes, there is a deployment guide that they update, periodically. And inside of that, they would give you your release changes of, oh, we added this feature and this tag came along with it situation. Now, the further back you are, the more of these things you're going to go. But yes, they do at least write it down. Now, whether or not that's always accurate, because I've always found tags in the config file that's not even in the document, months later. So, they try, I think is the short answer to that question.
Yeah, it reminds me of the old saying, if you're for programmers, don't debug comments, only debug code. So the templates are the actual code
Exactly.
in this case, and the documentation is just the comments. So it's helpful if it's helpful. So another
Yeah.
question, and you guys who are joining us, we love these questions. This is really helpful to help us understand what needs to be clarified. And also, Sherwin would be glad to jump on a meeting with anybody here to talk through these things or to help troubleshoot or to train your team more if you want to go further or dig into this in an interactive environment instead of just a webinar training. So another question here, Sherwin, is the push notification. So in the diagram, if you can rewind, it's almost at the beginning of the presentation. We had the diagram showing kind of the architecture of that's used for push notification, and the diagram of the WebEx for BroadWorks Solution Guide. It once showed, and the version online might still show this as of time of recording, but it once showed that the BroadWorks service provider connecting directly to Google and Apple. This diagram we've corrected. It doesn't actually have that picture on there showing that particular thing. can you tell us about that change? When
Yes.
when did that go away, or was that accurate at some point? It's not accurate anymore. Tell us about what's going on there.
Yeah, so from my experience working with it, the connection what Mark is talking about is that they used to have a second connection coming from this solution here over to APNS and FCM. And this guide was provided when you were this diagram here in this guide was provided when you first had UC Connect and you were expected to migrate off to WebEx, right? So
Mm.
when you had UC Connect, you had your self-branded applications, and those had your branded applications for your company with your own Apple ID and your own Google ID application IDs. And so when you were sending push notifications in the past and configuring the NPS, you were going directly to APNS and FCM. But as you transition those users off of UC Connect to WebEx, then that transition happened from NPS to the NPS proxy in WebEx Cloud. So during your migration, you did have two connections. You had one, well, three, if you technically, if you're going to count Apple and Google separately, you had three connections. You had the two coming from the NPS off to the cloud, one for APNS and one for SCM. And then you had the WebEx connection that you put in place for the NPS proxy. And then when you migrated your user from Connect to WebEx, then it kind of deprecated this connection. So that's what I've seen in the past of how to show.
So what you would expect is a system that's really only supporting WebEx for BroadWorks now. It's not going to be maintaining the certificate, the CA certificates, or anything related to connecting to FireCloud messaging or Apple push notification service. Like those are gone,
Correct.
really,
Those are
if
gone.
you're only
For a
on
brand new
WebEx.
installation.
Okay.
Yeah, if you're only on WebEx and for brand new installation, you never have to log into Apple or Google interfaces at all.
Okay, super. Thanks for clarifying that. So yeah, they have different obligations in the Cisco documentation than we have for purposes of our training. So I get that difference. So another question, maybe the last for today that we'll have time for is, can you go to the slide where you're talking about setting up the cluster and is it related to flow through provisioning build out?
I believe that.
There we go. Yeah, so you're building out a cluster. So for BroadWorks engineers, we heard the word cluster. Yeah. We think an application server cluster. Are these generally going to be the same?
No, this is a ADP WebEx cluster. So kind of think of Compilot where you can have multiple application clusters behind the Compilot interface. This is the same thing. So what we're talking about here are front-end ADP platforms that has the auth service, XSI actions, XSI events, and CTI interface on it. And then those ADP servers will talk to the network server, and then those network servers will redirect them to the appropriate application server cluster. If you have 5 clusters behind that ADP cluster, then you're talking about 5 AS clusters. All the same, as long as it can get to the right place.
Gotcha. So when they're talking about cluster, they're probably thinking in terms of a redundant ADP cluster that's front-ending potentially unlimited number of app servers, at least an arbitrary number of app servers that are based on your load engineering calculation there.
Yeah, or an environment, right? So there's a production cluster. There's usually a lab cluster. Or some folks will have a US versus an EU BroadWorks environment. So these are 2 different clusters. So whatever that ADP is talking to, whatever the network server can correspond with and get updates from, that's defined as a cluster. The cluster is linked to the network server, in short. Kind of like how the NFM works, where the NFM license is linked to a network server cluster. Technically, that's how BroadWorks break that out.
Great. So this is really the last question, and then we'll wrap up. But it was a great question that came in. If you could go to the diagram, the original architecture diagram, it does not show the bring your own PSTN on that diagram. So if you were going to throw this in, it's going to be a different cloud connecting back to the BroadWorks service provider. But could you maybe, sort of explain to us a little bit where the bring your own PSTN would, what it would look like here a little bit?
Bring your own PSTN would. You would have a PSTN cloud out here that would actually come into the network server. That network server will talk to the app server. That app server would then come back out around here to this in essence is a session border controller. That session border controller would go off to WebEx. And then for outbound calls, we're talking about WebEx calling outbound using the DID, which comes through that socket here as well. which then goes to network server, which then goes out to the PSTN.
For that outbound calling, we're talking about we're launching a call from the Webex client.
From the Webex client.
And
correct.
the Webex client, so that's the Webex app on the kind of the bottom right. It's doing call control through Webex Cloud. Eventually, though, there's an invite that comes. Is that invite going to come from, and I know we're asking you to move on your toes here, but is that invite going to come directly from the Webex app through what they're calling the VoIP calling square into the SBC from the client, or is it going to, and then use the infrastructure?
We're talking about
from a
meetings.
Conference, right? Right.
Yeah, we're talking about from a conference. So that's not a client solution. That's a meeting cloud solution. So this is a meeting cloud to SBC and out is what we're talking about here.
So it's really independent. There already is there's one call path where the client's making a call. It's just functioning as a device registered to BroadWorks. And then there's another flow.
On the bottom, correct.
Right. We don't have the lines for it, but this other flow is, you can say, from the meetings box. You said it goes down through that. We can just call it the VoIP calling blue square, and then it's going to reach to the service provider SBC down there that you're showing in the gray boxes. Otherwise unlabeled. As session border controller boxes to have that call come in. Now that call is going to route in. Is that going to look in BroadWorks like a call from a device, or is that going to route in as like a routing NE where it's going to come in from the SBC and go to the network server?
It's going to go from the SBC to the network server as a routing NE. You need to define a routing NE for this solution to bring your own PSTN solution. Whereas
the client, it's a registered device. It's going to look like just an access device. It's going to route in.
Correct.
And you may register through the network server, but ultimately that invite's going to go from the SBC to the app server. So different animal in that particular case. Great question. Appreciate that question that came in. Okay. Thanks for everyone who stayed a little bit late to go over those. Thanks very much, Sherwin, for your explanations here. Like I mentioned, Sherwin's happy to meet with anybody who'd like to talk through more of this. You could reach out, and if you attended, we'll send you access to the slides and the video. Thanks again, Sherwin. Great job. I appreciate your work.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for joining me.